When conversations around mold come up, they often focus on the problem, what went wrong, who's at fault, or that standards weren't followed. What we talk about less often is the long behind the scenes work required to raise the bar for an entire industry. That work doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen by accident. Today's conversation focuses on mold, not just as a technical issue, but as a leadership and advocacy story. To this, I'm pleased to welcome three experts from the IICRC, Robbie Bradshaw, Holly Burns, and Mark Cornelius. Welcome, everybody. It's great to have you on the program. Mark,
Sure.
we're going to start with you on our first question. Are you ready?
I am, Jeff. Thank you very much.
If you could, for people who may not know the history, how did the IICRC S520 come into existence, and what problem was it originally designed to solve for the industry?
Well, thank you, Jeff. Obviously, I'm Mark Cornelius. I've been in the cleaning and restoration industry now for right at 42 years. So I've actually seen pretty much everything kind of come into play, all the way from cleaning carpet to rebuilding buildings from the ground up. And I also have the honor and pleasure of serving on the board of directors with Dr. Holly Burns. And I've been on the board now for 4 years, so involved with quite a bit of stuff that's going on. So, to your question about how the S520 was basically brought into being, we have to first start with the S500, which was the standard that came out for the water damage restoration industry. But the S500 did not really address anything with mold. It recognized and understood that mold starts with water, but it really didn't have anything to do with real life world, mold remediation challenges. The S520 was developed primarily for mold remediation companies and the workers, along with experts and people like industrial hygienists and things and consultants. But it was primarily developed for the contractor to be able to do the mold remediation side of it. And Jeff, mold's been a concern for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years. And it really started becoming prevalent in the United States around the 1970s and 80s when sick building syndrome first came out. And then sick building syndrome kind of turned into, basically toxic, mold syndrome around the early 90s. And then it kind of morphed into some of the other stuff where some of the early guidances dealt with situations involving like the health care industry and public health officials and stuff. And I don't mean to use these words in a bad way, but there was a lot of hype. There was a lot of heightened awareness. There was sensationalism due to media. There was some large, litigation cases. Aaron Brockovich, Ed McMahon's dog, the Melinda Ballard situation. And then the mold is gold, and mold's the next asbestos. And then every water job turned in from a $2,000 job to a $40,000 job. And then there was the Cleveland, Ohio incident where there was about 37 babies, a cluster of babies that got sick. 12 of them died. The CDC came out. They made a bunch of comments. And then in 2000, they came back out and said that they actually didn't have a causal link to the deaths from it. So there was a need for the restoration industry to have a standard. And here's the thing I don't know if you're aware of, Jeff. There's an actual King of the Hill episode that came out in 2003 dedicated to the mold remediation industry.
I am not caught up on my King of the Hill episodes, so I need to do that, Mark, obviously.
Season 8, episode 6.
Okay, I'll write that down. There we go. Thank you, Mark. A great introduction and comment there. Holly, let's go to you from the work you do. Kind of the same question. Anything to add there about the history and how maybe you use the S520 as well?
Thank you for having me here. I am very honored to be here with these astounding people. But my name is Dr. Holly Burns. I also am on the board of directors, And I've been in restoration for nearly 20 years, doing restoration and managing a restoration company and then owning my own indoor air company. So right now we do assessments, and I also train for the AMRT, WRT, ASD, and now the HST courses. The S520 was born out of necessity because before it existed, mold remediation was largely inconsistent. Methods varied widely and documentation was uneven. So there was very little alignment between what the contractors did and what building science supported. So, from an assessment standpoint, this really, or that at that particular time, really created a risk. And so the S520 was developed and established as a science based consensus standard that defined what's reasonable and appropriate remediation. And actually, what does that look like? Grounded in exposure control, contamination management, and occupant safety. So at the end of the day, what are we really looking at? We're looking at the health of the occupants and the structural stability of that property, which I believe is the most important asset many people have is their home and then more importantly their health.
And Robbie, I don't think you're a mold assessor or inspector or worker. Introduce yourself and tell us what you think about this as well. And the S520, what that means to you and the work you do.
So thanks, Jeff, for having me. Again, my name is Robbie Bradshaw. I'm the Director of Government Relations for the IICRC. One of I think the important aspect of the S520 from my standpoint is I think every legislator that I have ever talked to has received at least one call from a constituent complaining about mold in some capacity. And almost every single time, they have no idea how to address it. They don't know what to say back to the constituent. They believe that the industry is regulated, even though it's not. So they never know. And so what I tell them is, there are certifications. There is a standard of care for the industry, and it's extremely helpful because once they hear that there's a standard of care for the industry, that's when their eyes open. They're like, okay, so there is an answer to my constituent's question. Now, how do we address that? And we go from there.
Thank you, Robbie. Back to you, Mark, on this next question. We know that standards don't write themselves. We also know they change over time. Let's talk about that. What have you seen with the S520, how it's changed or evolved? And what does that look like when things change, like the science, the technology, maybe the work done to remove mold?
Well, Jeff, that's a $1 million question there because every time the standard gets revised and there's a new opinion about a change in science or risk factors, I've not met a single person yet who serves on a standards consensus body that's not passionate about something. And even though we do our best to make sure that we're bringing actual citable outside sources to it, there's a lot of opinion that gets introduced into it as well. So it takes a lot of time to get to the bottom of it, and it can be heated, it can be contentious, and that just goes to show that all of the sides are trying to bring what's best for the industry, not just it being one-sided. So it can take time. The original S520 took almost 3 years, a little over 3 years for 14 volunteers to bring the first edition out. But interestingly, it can take even longer sometimes, like the last version of the S540, the trauma standard, took 2+ years just to revise the original standard because there are a lot of times some changes. There may be new OSHA regulations or health and safety concerns or a new technology. And just because there's a new chemical out on the market, sometimes, magic potions doesn't mean that it's suitable for the industry. So it's quite a labor of love to determine if it is going to actually be applicable to what we're doing, because we're trying to leave the customer in a safe and healthy environment.
Holly, anything to add to what Mark just said there?
So I think one of the most important things to understand is that the S520 is a living standard. So as remediators and assessors, we see firsthand how building materials, moisture dynamics, and occupant vulnerability change over time. And so the IICRC updates the S520 through a structured consensus process, like Mark was talking about, that includes researchers, clinicians, remediators, and risk professionals. So when new science emerges, whether it's about aerosolization, immunocompromised individuals and occupants, equipment, or containment effectiveness, it's evaluated, it's debated, like Mark was talking about with the 14 people that had a hand in it, and integrated thoughtfully and not reactively.
Let's stick with you on this question, then we'll go to Mark. And then my next question after that is all about the legal stuff. So, Robbie, we'll tee you up there. But, Holly, thinking about IICRC training, which you and Mark both do, but thinking about that, how does it translate what's written in the S520 into practical, defensible decisions contractors can make in the field and rely on in the field?
And Jeff, really, this is where training is critical because the IICRC, the S520, isn't just a checklist, it's a decision making framework standard. And so, in training, like Mark does, we both do, we teach professionals how to interpret conditions, assess the risk, and justify their approach. And I always say justify every decision you make based on the principles rather than any shortcuts. From an assessor's or a remediator standpoint, this is actually huge because, as you mentioned, Jeff, the defensibility that comes from being able to explain why a method was selected and not just that it was done.
Mark, I know you're chomping at the bit to get into that. What would you say?
Thank you, Jeff. And I, Dr. Burns really said quite a good amount of information there. And, as she stated, I teach a lot of AMRT courses. I actually have 6 different subject matters that I deliver for IICRC. And, WRT is one of them, but IICRC approved instructors that deliver IICRC approved courses are supposed to bring the principles set forth in the standards to real world practice. This is also based off of the instructor's experience in the field. So if you've got an instructor who's got a lot of, like Holly said, 20 years experience in it, it's not that hard to bring it forward into it, but the courses are developed through what's called a CPD, the Certification Program Description. That's based off of what the standard brings forward, plus additional stuff that instructor brings into it from their personal experience. So the contractor should also understand that when doing mold remediation, though, the S500 is also still applicable because the only reason you have mold, is because you have water. So one of the biggest misconceptions, in my opinion, I'll try to wrap this up really quick, is maybe it's just a pick on words, but a lot of restorers use the standard to defend their actions, when in my opinion, I use the standard to judge my decisions prior to doing the job. And then therefore, if they're sound to the standard, then I don't have to defend anything. So the training basically is based off of the understanding of that standard.
Robbie, this one's for you. We know that mold has increasingly become a public health and housing issue, not just a restoration issue, but talk about this. When did the IICRC begin to recognize that its standards and expertise could play a bigger role beyond the job site and in your world, especially in policy and legislative conversations?
I was hired on in 2021 with the idea that we were going to build up the IICRC Advocacy Department, that we were going to create it. But I think IICRC standards, especially the S520, found its way into legislation, back in 2007 in Kentucky. And that was without any sort of, from my understanding, any sort of, push from the IICRC. So I think that the leadership at the time had realized that, okay, this is something that we need to do. Our standards need to be recognized. Our certifications need to be recognized. And obviously, like you said, mold is one of the larger policy issues that we are seeing. And so that is probably, I would say, 75% of my conversations with policymakers is about mold and mold remediation. And so the S520 and the AMRT and the MRS get brought up a lot in conversation. And again, the policymakers are excited that there is something out there that they don't have to reinvent the wheel. And we've been successful.
Can you talk a little bit about how you introduce those thoughts to these policymakers? Like, what do those conversations sound like? Do you meet them in the hallway in Washington? Are you sending off some emails? What does that look like?
It's a mixture. We attend conferences where state legislators are at, and we have a lot of conversations there. We have conversations in DC, on Capitol Hill. And then sometimes it's just like this, very just Zoom calls. And a lot of the times there will be consumers that have had bad experiences with non-certified mold remediators who weren't following the standard. And then you even have some remediators who are saying we need to have some sort of guardrails in our state. Can you help? And so we work with IICRC certified firms and IICRC certified technicians, as well as consumers, to advocate for our industry and for industry standards.
So where we're at right now with IICRC involvement in Washington and all the states with what you're doing, where are we in that pathway? Are we to the 50-yard line? Super Bowl was recent. Are
Yeah,
we making real progress there?
yeah, I 100% think we're making real progress. I mean, when I was interviewed at the IICRC, one of the conversations that was brought up was that they kept hearing in the news about mold and military housing, and they were like, "It's a long shot, but we keep hearing about it." And I said, well, one of the things that the federal government does very often is they incorporate standards by reference, whether it's ASHRAE or NADCA or some, any sort of nonprofit organization, standard developing organization. And I said, well, we could get, the IICRC mold remediation standard, which I had no idea what that was at that time, but I knew that it was a thing. I said we could get that adopted by the federal government. And just recently, the Department of Defense is now being required by Congress to develop guidelines in accordance with the S520, and essentially is incorporating it by reference. And so I would consider that a win for sure, especially for our military members and their families. But I think it also shows progress for our industry.
I know we've had conversations, Robbie, about that in the past, and it's great to see the results there. Of course, it's still a long road ahead, but it's
Yeah.
progress, and others are starting to take notice. Let's move back to you, Holly, on this question. Thinking about the ones you train, those business owners, those managers of restoration companies. What does it mean for them when these standards we're talking about? And I think Mark wins the award of knowing what they all are, right? He's got probably post-it notes there with all the acronyms and stuff. But Holly, what does it mean to them when these are referenced in policy, in legislative forums? And how should they be thinking about that when they think about the training you offer?
Oh, absolutely. Great question. Because as mold moved from being seen as kind of a nuisance issue, historically speaking, like Mark was saying, it then moved into becoming a public health issue. And this is really important to me because that's what I just got my PhD in, is environmental epidemiology. So public health and policy and then became such a liability issue that it became clear that technical expertise was needed outside the job site. Assessors and remediators often sit at the intersection of health concerns, building science, and legal scrutiny. So the IICRC, I believe, recognized that without an established standard, policymakers were left to fill kind of a gap, like Robbie's talking about, and often without any technical grounding. So that's when the standards and training assists with what Robbie's doing out there at and trying to make policies. And I know Robbie has helped me in Florida quite a bit, trying to move and make an impact for policy.
Thank you, Holly. Yeah, Robbie's a great resource. I'm glad he's on with the IICRC. We see so many good things coming with legislation
Yeah.
and laws and regulations, all those things. But Mark, so do you have a bunch of post-it notes with all the acronyms and the S520, S540, S5?
Five,
Is it all in your
sixty,
head? Is it in your head?
700. Most of them are, Jeff. It's just a big giant post-it note. That's why we had to make sure I knew what time to log in for this meeting today.
Well, you did a great job with that. But same question to you. What, as a trainer and helping these companies, what are you seeing and how do they view, how should they view this?
Well, Jeff, I'm glad you asked that question because as an educator, I've seen even some of the students who have come through my own classes. A lot of people just do not take stock in the standards and the fact that they're out there. I'm remiss to say that a friend of mine who's come through my classes is saying that, well, the standards are, and it points out that they're voluntary. Yeah, they're voluntary, but it is the measuring stick that we are judged against if things do happen to go legal. And there's, unfortunately, a lot of contractors don't understand that government in the states and even on the city level, in some cases, are adopting either legislation or, like as Robbie pointed out, Kentucky adopting the entire S520 as their standard for mold remediation. And if I said that wrong, Robbie, you can correct me. But the the point of it is it's out there, and you can choose to ignore it if you want to, just like you can ignore the speed limit sign on the interstate. But you can do anything you want to, you get caught, and you usually, you're losing your profits. But Jeff, I want to wrap up my comment here on this, and the fact that I tell my students we are in an industry that we can hurt people if we do not do our job right. If we don't dry buildings out correctly, that leads to the mold issue. If we don't do our jobs correctly on the mold side of things, then people can get sick. And the standards are there, and they're written by people that have experienced that on so many different levels that it's there to give people guidance. It's procedural, guidance on how to stay out of trouble. And if we do our jobs right, then the customer, the client, the homeowner, the military housing people, they're the ones that benefit from it. And we do make money. But at the end of the day, we're here to make sure people stay healthy.
I agree with that. Robbie, I'm going to throw you a question from left field.
Okay.
As an attorney, if you're going to trial, if you're going to represent somebody, how important are these standards for you to do what you do for people who need your legal help?
I think it's vitally important that people really understand what standard of care means from a legal standpoint. So, when you are a restorer or any sort of contractor and you do work improperly, and let's say a homeowner or a business owner, whoever hired you, sues you, generally what they're going to sue you for is negligence. And behind negligence, it means that you had a duty to perform work in a certain way, that you breached that duty, and that the damage caused to the homeowner or the business owner or whomever was approximate actual cause from your breach of that duty. So basically, the S520 says this is your duty. This is how you should perform the work. If you breach that duty and someone is damaged, they're going to reference that standard as whether or not, the damage was caused by your breach. So I think that it's vitally important that people really understand that. And that standard of care is not just some word that's being thrown around, but it actually means something from a legal standpoint.
Thank you, Robbie. That's good information and great guidance for those watching the program today and thinking about what they should do to protect themselves and their companies. Let's get some final comments. My last question is just thinking about looking ahead. And let's start with Holly on this. Looking ahead, where do you see the biggest opportunities or the biggest challenges, the speed bumps coming up for the mold remediation industry as awareness, scrutiny, and expectations just continue to increase every day?
So as awareness increases, so does demand for qualified remediators and assessors. And the qualification truly comes from the training and referencing and reviewing the standards. Also, evidence-based remediation and clear communication. The challenge is that shortcuts will be less tolerated. And so, from my perspective, the industry is moving toward greater accountability, but also greater respect for those who perform mold remediation and have the technical expertise because they have the standards backing them and they have the education and certification from the IICRCs.
No more shortcuts, but that's how we save money. Mark?
One of the biggest speed bumps that I see is on the restoration contractor side of it, because there's so many different opinions about what is and isn't out there. One of the biggest things that I hear is, cleaning to zero. We can't leave anything behind. There's a chance that someone can get sick. So we just keep coming up with ways to try to make more work out of it. But most people, when it comes to mold, especially, a lot of it is not necessarily covered by insurance. And we're pricing ourselves out of a market that is needed to be performed. So instead of coming up with all these neat new tricks, it's not that hard to do mold remediation, folks. You get in there, you get it cleaned up, you remove the stuff that needs to be done, and stop trying to turn it into rocket science. We need rockets and we need science, but at the end of the day, we just need to get some elbow grease in there. It's not easy, glamorous work sometimes, but if we will just stop trying to make stuff up and actually do what we need to do, we can do a good job. And when we have bad actors, we all look bad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's guidance. It's all right there for you. So good thoughts, Mark. Robbie, what would you like to see people do with this information today and just to make this industry a better place from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important that people, one, follow what the kind of laws and regulations that are happening in their state. The IICRC has a great resource on our website under the Advocacy tab. There's a map. You can click on your state and you can see all the legislation that is currently happening. We also send out some quarterly updates. But to Mark and Dr. Burns's point, I mean, I think that there's a bit of sensationalism that's going on, but there's also a lot of bad actors in the industry because there is there's no benchmark. There's nothing stopping us from just entering the industry. I can jump in and start a mold remediation company today, and nothing stopping me from doing that. And I think that it's important that we have some guardrails in place, and that we advocate for the standard of care to be adopted, and we advocate for certifications. And that way we can make sure that we're protecting the public health and we're protecting the consumers that whose homes we're working on.